Hey guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at a pretty cool package that I got on eBay today. It's from Japan. Really excited about this one. It is the Game Boy Light, a Japanese only version of the Game Boy that was released in 1998. And one of the cool features about this is that it was the first Nintendo handheld to feature a backlit screen. Now, this wasn't new for handhelds in general because there were other systems like the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx that had already been out and featured backlit screens. But for Nintendo, this was the first. As we all know, the original Game Boy, which was released in 1989, it was a pretty big success due to its affordability and great library of games. But the problem with it was the screen was only in black and white, or actually in shades of green, and it didn't even have any sort of backlight to it. So if you tried to play in the dark, you couldn't see anything. So you needed to buy all these light accessories and just to try to play it in the dark, but it's not really practical due to making the Game Boy much bigger than it already is. Then, of course, in 1996, they released the Game Boy Pocket. It was a smaller version of the Game Boy. It had a improved screen that instead of shades of green, it was in an actual grayscale. But the problem with the lighting still existed. Still no backlight. Couldn't really play in the dark. So then they released the Game Boy Light. That's where this comes in. It was initially released in two colors, silver and gold, but there were a couple of special editions that came out as well. But for whatever reason, it was never released outside of Japan. What we did get here instead, and also in Japan, was the Game Boy Color in 1998, which had a color screen, but that didn't have a backlight. They pretty much skipped the Game Boy Light because they knew the Game Boy Color was going to come out, so they saw no point in releasing another version of the original Game Boy, because that's what this is. It still plays only original Game Boy games and still doesn't have a color screen. I would imagine they didn't put backlight and color screen because of costs. It would probably be too expensive. Just looking at other handheld systems from the era of the Game Boy, like the Sega Game Gear and Atari Lynx, and others such as the Turbo Express and the Sega Nomad, they all had big problems despite being superior graphically to the Game Boy. Like, their battery life was pretty low, they were pretty bulky, and they weren't as reliable. That's also what led to the Game Boy's success despite the inferior screen. So what the Game Boy Light does is it has, see, the screen turns blue. As you can tell, it works. Alright, so the Game Boy Light looks fairly similar to the Game Boy and the Game Boy Pocket, though slightly taller than the Game Boy Pocket. Same button layout, same everything. But see, the power switch has 3 sections. Turning it up once, it just powers on the Game Boy with no light, and putting it all the way to the right turns the backlight on. And it uses 2 AA batteries, which the Game Boy Pocket used 2 AAA batteries, and the original Game Boy used 4 AA batteries. And it still has a contrast slider, volume, and link cable ports, which this uses the same link cable that the Game Boy Pocket uses and the Game Boy Color would eventually use. So now I got a couple of games I'm gonna just test it with. Got these 4 games here. These are actually all Japanese games I bought at a convention a few months ago. Here's Tetris, Yoshi's Cookie, Pocket Monsters Red, which is Pokemon Red, and Rockman World 3, which is just Mega Man 3, the Game Boy version. Alright, so now I put Tetris in, and I'm going to show you the Game Boy Light in action. See, I just turned it on once. See, it's just a normal non-backlit. And then you turn it, the switch on to the far right, and see the backlight turns on, which is a nice greenish blue. It's typical for devices of this era to have a backlight similar to this. See, works. And as you can tell, this is actually the original version 1.0 of Tetris, evident by the music. Gonna show you the contrast. Obviously, I can't play it with one hand, but I'll try. Just looking at it on the camera. Yeah, just sucking because I'm playing with one hand. I'm gonna at least try to clear some lines there. Yeah. Oh. Yep. Alright, so now I'm just gonna lose. Alright. So as you can see, it works pretty well. I'm gonna just show you samples of some other the other games. Putting in Rockman World 3. Oh, it's glitchy. yeah, as you can see, it works pretty well. I like the nice blue hue that it has. And last but not least, I want to show how it looks in the dark with the screen light on. Excellent. As for the rest of the world, we didn't get a backlit Game Boy system until the Game Boy Advance SP came out in 2002. Which, as we all know, that became probably the best way to play Game Boy games, as not only it was a Game Boy Advance, but it also plays Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. The Game Boy Light predates the Game Boy Color, so it only plays original Game Boy games, the gray ones, as well as the Game Boy Color enhanced ones, which are typically black, but still have the little dent on the top. So you can use it in an original Game Boy, but it doesn't let you play the clear Game Boy Color games like this one. It would give you an error message when you turned it on. So yeah, overall I'm pretty happy with my purchase of the Game Boy Light. I had always wanted one of these ever since I found out about this, probably in like 2004, just on a Japanese website. I think it was Nintendo's Japanese website. I had seen this and I'm like, Game Boy Light? I never knew about this. But then saw it was Japan only. So obviously that wasn't something I could reasonably go to a store and buy without getting it on eBay, which I obviously didn't know how to use as a 7-year-old. But these aren't very common. They're not rare either, but they're far less common than finding a Game Boy Pocket or something. So that's all for this video. What do you guys all think about the Game Boy Light? Any of you guys have this, or have any experiences with it, or are just intrigued by it, that this was something Nintendo decided not to bring over to the US or Europe or wherever you guys live? But as always, more to come. Thanks for watching and stay tuned. Bye now.